In 2008, Bethesda Game Studios released a new game, a game that was not an Elder Scrolls game, but definitely had been influenced by the Elder Scrolls formula. In this video, it's time for me to ask the question, what do I love about Fallout 3?
Just want to start a flame in your heart.
It might seem a little strange to be considering a Fallout game when discussing what it is that makes the Elder Scrolls such a great series, but back in 2008, when Bethesda Game Studios announced they were going to release this game, the Fallout community was a little divided. Quite a lot of them were not happy and felt that Bethesda were the wrong group to take on this franchise. A lot of the people were saying things like, it's just going to be Oblivion with guns, and they meant that as an insult. However, I didn't take it that way. In fact, I quite looked forward to the idea of Oblivion with guns, as they were calling it. I felt that Bethesda were actually the right company to take over. Whilst there may be some differences in style between them and the original devs, the core concept of being able to create your own story is something that was in Fallout and is something that Elder Scrolls is well known for. And in my opinion, many of the things that made Morrowind and Oblivion such great games were present in Fallout 3. So Fallout 3 was heavily influenced by the Elder Scrolls formula. But more importantly for this series, I believe Fallout 3 had an effect on the Elder Scrolls formula. I think a number of things that appeared in Fallout 3, a number of the changes that occurred, made their way to Skyrim. And so Fallout 3 is an important game to consider when trying to narrow down what the Elder Scrolls formula is. So let's get started with what I loved about Fallout 3. Number one was the world. Yet again, Bethesda managed to create a world I just wanted to explore. It was incredibly detailed, it was beautiful, even though it was a desolate wasteland. I remember that moment, you know, when you leave the vault and your eyes are adjusting to the sunlight and you're getting your first glimpse of the wasteland. The excitement I felt at that moment was incredible. I'm probably going to remember that moment for the rest of my life. It was so intense. I mean, Bethesda ruined it about a second later by having a level up screen pop in front of my face. Yeah, well done on that one, by the way, Bethesda. Way to ruin a moment. But once I'd got my level sorted out and I walked forward and looked down on the land, I just fell in love. I knew yet again that all I wanted to do was run off and explore everything. Walking through Springvale for the first time, I was just so excited. Way more excited than a man should be playing a computer game. I loved Megaton, I loved Rivet City, I loved travelling between those places, I loved the DC Capital, I even loved the subways. A lot of people hated those. I loved those. I thought that was such fun. Kind of scary, but fun. They just went on forever. I thought it was a superb way of travelling around that map. So I even loved that. This was just another game in which I found exploration to be almost as much fun as questing and fighting. In fact, it might have actually been one of the best things about Fallout 3. The second thing I loved about Fallout 3 was modding. That is something that drew me back into that game over and over again. I actually had an initial break after I first played Fallout, and then I came back after a little while and I created my first mod because something was bothering me in the vanilla game. And that was the beginning of a kind of love affair I have with modding in general. Obviously, The Elder Scrolls already had a thriving mod community, but I think Fallout 3 brought in a lot of new blood, people who wouldn't have been as interested because they're not necessarily as passionate about fantasy games. So even though Fallout 3 still has less mods created than a game such as Oblivion, it still has a very active and very passionate modding community behind it. And whilst I don't want to talk too much about Fallout New Vegas here, you could see very clearly that Fallout New Vegas had taken a lot of inspiration from the modding community over in Fallout 3. There were many new features that were pretty much directly lifted from a lot of the popular mods in Fallout 3. Something else I really enjoyed about Fallout 3, or really loved about Fallout 3, was the followers, the companions that you could meet and take along with you on your adventure. Now, in The Elder Scrolls, I really pretty much ignored all of the followers. I never found any of them interesting, and I generally liked to play as the lone hero. I did the same in Fallout 3 for most of the playthroughs I did in the early days, but I would always at least entertain some of the followers, take them with me for some periods of time, especially the dog, for example. I loved having the dog. But even if I didn't necessarily travel with them, I might leave them back at my home, and it was always nice to see the dog when I came home. And I felt this was something I'd never felt before in Elder Scrolls games. So for me, Fallout 3 did a better job at making the companions interesting enough to make me actually want to interact with them, to make me want to learn about them, find their story. Sydney, for example, her story is incredible. I won't spoil it for you if you've not played the game. So generally, I think they took the idea of the companions to the next level, and I really did like that. Something else I really did love in Fallout 3, and this is something from all of the Fallout games actually, it's perks. Now, they didn't bring back traits, which disappointed me a little bit, but I don't want to focus on the negative things in this video, only the things I loved about Fallout 3, and perks is one of them. I like character building, I like quite complex character builds, I like stats, I like skills, but perks have always been fascinating for me because they always add something unusual, they always add some unique flavour to your character if you want, and Fallout 3 was no exception. I mean, it did have some boring perks, some perks that just gave you a boost to a skill, but it also had a lot of interesting perks that changed things quite dramatically, things that would be either amusing, entertaining, or just, again, change the way you would play. None of the Fallout games ever had particularly complex or detailed character building systems, but perks was something they've always had, and I've always loved that concept. Another thing I loved was the music. Not necessarily the ambient music or the theme music, even though those were pretty good. The ambient music really did suit the game. The theme music is pretty damned cool, and I still get that little feeling of excitement when I hear the theme music and I can picture the loading screen. But I'm talking about the radio music. I think the addition of a radio to your Pip-Boy and to the Wasteland in general was one of those genius ideas that really made Fallout 3 kind of, not unique, but it definitely gave it its own feel. The fact that you had a DJ out there somewhere who was not only talking about your excellent exploits, but playing some very, very cool, dated, but very appropriate music. It gave the game a lot of atmosphere. And that leads on to something else I loved, actually. It's the fact that you came from a vault. And the reason I say that it leads on from that is Three Dog would often talk about the kid from 101 doing these amazing deeds, or dastardly deeds if you were doing evil things. And I always loved the fact that I came from a vault. Now this is a little bit of a unique love when considering what we're talking about, which is the Elder Scrolls formula. Because of course, a big part of the Elder Scrolls formula has been the freedom to make up your own story, including your background. Fallout never really allowed you to do that. And for some reason it doesn't bother me in Fallout. I quite like the fact that you've got a backstory, and I love the fact that the backstory, as always, you are basically a naive person who's been isolated from the world you are about to be thrust into. In the first game you were a vault dweller, in the third game you were a vault dweller, and in the second game they mimicked it in a similar way by making you a tribal who'd been, again, isolated from the ravages of the wasteland in this little village. And the reason I loved this, especially the Vault Dweller, I did prefer Fallout 1 and 3 because of this. The Vault Dweller persona allows you to play basically yourself in a way. It allows you to play someone who's completely naive to the wasteland and has the sensibilities of you and I, someone from a modern, westernized, I would say nation, but in this case society. Life in the vault wasn't too different to the life you and I lead when compared to, say, the life of the average wastelander at that time. You know, they had electricity, they had lights, heating, clean water, food, safety, clothing, everything. You know, they even had computers, so they could probably play computer games. They had what we would consider civilization. And to take such a vault dweller and then thrust him into this Mad Max-like world was essentially the same as picking you and I and throwing us into that world, and I always loved that. But, as I've hinted at before, I think Bethesda should be wary about seeing things that worked in other games and other franchises, even their own, and moving them over to the Elder Scrolls if, in doing so, they endanger something that people love about that particular series. And I have a feeling a lot of people do like the complete freedom they get in the Elder Scrolls. So messing with that formula just because people like me happen to love the Vault Dweller story in Fallout is, in my opinion, a dangerous thing. I want you to keep that all in mind when I discuss the last thing that I loved about Fallout 3. Well, it's probably not the last thing I loved about Fallout 3, but it's the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video, and that is VATS. VATS, in my opinion, was a genius idea. If you remember back to the discussion of combat in the last video where I talked about Morrowind having a system of combat that relied upon the character's skill to decide whether or not you hit, and in Oblivion it was really your personal skill that decided if you hit, in Fallout 3 you had both. You could use normal FPS style mechanics to shoot your enemies, and of course that relies on your own aim, your own ability to move, or you could use VATS, which transferred control over to the character, and it did it in a really good way. It genuinely felt like a hybrid system, something halfway between the FPS game, because of course you still had to move your character into places of cover and so on, and the original game's isometric turn-based combat where you would target different parts of your enemy's body and then shoot at them and let the computer take control. So it was this kind of hybrid system that I think worked really well. It was very, very easy, very instinctive. It took only a few tries to completely master it. I mean, there wasn't much to master. It did pass a lot of the control over to your character, and of course that meant the better your character was at shooting, the more often he would hit. It had nothing to do with your aim skills. However, I have now drifted into dangerous territory. I am now doing what I said Bethesda should avoid doing until they have identified what the Elder Scrolls formula is, identify what it is about the Elder Scrolls games we love already. I'm now talking about something they could add. And I'm going to reiterate my warning to Bethesda before they even consider adding something like VATS. As great as it is, they should definitely identify what it is their fanbase love about the Elder Scrolls, and then, when considering adding something new like this, ask themselves, does it affect any of the other aspects, any of the other things that people love? Does it have any effect on those? And if it does, you need to be very careful about adding a feature such as this. And on that note, I'm going to leave this video there. Next time, we're going to cover a game that may be even more surprising than the fact that I covered Fallout 3 in an Elder Scrolls series. This game is not just a completely different franchise to the Elder Scrolls, it's not even the same developer. That's right, the game I'm going to look at wasn't even made by Bethesda Gaming Studios. However, once again, there are a lot of similarities between this game, Fallout 3, Oblivion, and the Elder Scrolls formula that we are talking about. It's an important game to look at, and therefore, next time I'm going to be asking, what is it that I love about Fallout New Vegas?
As I go right merrily along.